Welcome to the Black Creator Series, brought to you by Candlewick Press in collaboration with Red Clay Educators. Hosted by Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, bringing dynamic books, authors, illustrators, and artists to your classroom and to the world. Look for episodes of the Black Creator Series on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Here's Candlewick's Kathleen Rourke to introduce this week's guest.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Kathleen Rourke from Candlewick Press, and I'm looking forward to hearing from filmmaker, poet, and Coretta Scott King author honor award-winning creator Greg Neri, whose many books for young readers include Ghetto Cowboy, a thoughtful and entertaining coming-of-age story, which was adapted into the film Concrete Cowboy and followed by the equally moving Polo Cowboy. I now turn the conversation over to Dr. Sonja Cherry-Paul, a New York Times bestselling author, educator, founder of Red Clay Educators, and co-founder of the Institute for Racial Equity in Literacy.
Hi, Greg. Thanks for being on the Black Creator Series.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, as a young person, did you always see yourself as a writer? Was there a particular moment or an experience that influenced you?
Yeah, I always like to, when I'm talking to young people, I always like to say I am an accidental writer, that when I was young, I never thought I would be a writer. I never thought it was something I could or would do. I was a very visual person, so I was that kid, in the back, always drawing, and I would do comics and things like that. So writing came very late in my life. I was a filmmaker. I was a digital media producer also worked in animation and things like that, which are all forms of storytelling. And when my first book came about by accident, because, I stumbled across this real story and was convinced it would make an incredible film, which is, what I did. But as soon as I started down that path and was getting close to where people were interested and it could happen, something deep inside me kept kind of telling me this was the wrong way to tell this story. And I didn't know what that was about, but it was like a deep kind of gut check. And it was only later, after exploring like many different ways of possibly, how I could tell it this way or this way, I came across a friend of mine who was a graphic novelist, and he was, putting together a comic, and he showed me he had a script, and he finalized the script before he started drawing. And I was looking at a script, and it looked like a screenplay, which is what I had for this story. And, I grew up with comics. I love comics, never thought about doing it, but suddenly it clicked with me like, oh, this is cool, because comics are very cinematic. It's very visual language, but there's also written language in there. And as soon as I started thinking about it, things started to slide into place for me. And I suddenly decided like that was the way to tell the story. And my only problem was I had never done it. I'd not trained to be a graphic novelist or anything like that. But I realized, the only thing stopping me from doing it was myself, that I really had nothing to lose, because here I was, a guy who had never done a graphic novel. If I tried and failed, literally nobody would know. I would still be the same guy. But if I tried and succeeded, I would suddenly have this whole other medium to tell stories in. And as soon as I allowed myself to do that, kind of all the green lights came on, and that was it.
As I read Ghetto Cowboy, there were smells that I could smell. The imagery of the sneakers, the boots, the Ritz-Carlton, and those of you who have not read it yet, you'll have to read it to understand the sounds of the horses. And I particularly love the first encounter between Cole, the main character, and the horse that he would come to name Boo. So I want to show everybody Ghetto Cowboy, and then if it's okay, just read a little bit so that folks can hear that first encounter that I'm referring to. It starts here where you write, I turn slowly and see the biggest head I've ever seen on anything right in front of my face. I can't move. The horse's big old nose is sting me. I can feel it huffing and puffing, its nostrils opening up like they're gonna suck me right in. Then it raises its head and chomp. These giant teeth start pulling at the hay in my hand, chewing away, his big old eyes staring at me. It bites closer to my hand and I let go. He follows the hay to the ground and he keeps eating like I ain't even there. This thing is huge. I just stare at his giant yellow teeth as they crunch away. He do kind of act like a dog, so I slowly put my hand on his neck like Harper done. He don't flinch. His hair is rough like doll hair, but the fur on his neck is soft and smooth. What advice do you or might you offer young writers for bringing their own neighborhoods and communities? We'll talk more about that. But what advice might you offer for young people to do that, to bring it to life on the page?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I always tell young people is, because there's this natural thing where you think, oh, that's successful, so I should try to be like that.
Yeah.
And what they don't think about is that the real superpower is what makes them different than that, and not to go towards the popular, the successful, but to go away from it and to be as unique and true to yourself as you can be, because that, everybody sees the world differently. Everybody experiences differently, and only you can describe the world in the way you see it. So if, and I've done this exercise in school where I might bring up an event, something that happened. I might bring up talk about this class, this room we're in, and I want everybody to write it from their perspective. And you'll get 20 completely different stories, all based on the same thing. And that's kind of the beauty of storytelling for me, is how everyone sees it. And to me, there's no right or wrong way to tell a story. There's only your way. And, for me, I realized, there are some people who write beautifully, like their prose is so beautiful. You could quote a sentence from it and hang it on a wall or something. It's so like, oh. But I realized, like, that's not my thing. My thing is the rhythms of how people talk,
Yeah.
And my thing is telling a story through somebody's eyes, using their voice to tell a story, because that's a way of getting around not being that guy who can write that amazing, beautiful prose, but to tell a story as that 13-year-old boy might tell it or describe it. And that's what I love most, because I don't have to worry about, like, is this grammatically correct, or is this like, how it's like, hey, that's how this person sees it. That's how they tell it. And, I like the whole tradition of oral storytelling, because I tell every kid they're natural born storyteller. You put any one of them, hanging around between classes at their house with their friends, whatever. Everyone knows how to tell a story. Like, oh, you won't believe what I saw. Like, this girl, that girl, she was with this guy. And you get, like, people lean forward and like, what? You're getting audio cues back. Like, what? Like, reactions. You know how instinctively to build up your story to its natural climax and the big payoff where everyone's like, no, everybody knows how to do that.
Yeah.
And but when they think about writing, they freeze up because there's all that pressure that you have to write properly. You have to use correct grammar, and that kind of kills the creative impulse to write it as you see it or hear it. And so, like, that's fine, but when it comes to storytelling, use your voice, use how you see it, because nobody else will see it the same way.
That is such a powerful message for young people to hear, young people who may never would imagine themselves as writers, to hear from you that they already are. In the author's note of Ghetto Cowboys, you write about receiving a photo essay from Life magazine in 2008 that featured Black urban cowboys in Philadelphia, and your reaction being, what's going on here? And I can tell you that I had a very similar reaction when I learned about the Fletcher Street Urban Writing Club several years ago. There was like a digital short that I had access to. When did you learn about the history of Black cowboys, and what facilitated that learning for you?
Yeah, I mean, it started with that article, and those photos were just, they made you sit up and go like, what is going on here? I mean, I've been a lot of neighborhoods in a lot of different cities around this country, but there was something about these images of these young Black men, boys and men, you know, riding horses through the inner city of North Philadelphia. And when I see images like that, my mind starts thinking like, well, one, like, what is going on here?
Mm-hmm.
And two, how is it that there are these Black urban cowboys in North Philadelphia? Because to me, that's a story, the why. Because things like this don't just happen by accident. There's a reason. And then once you start digging into the reason out of your own natural curiosity, the stuff you come up, you know, uncover is like gold. I mean, I remember, you know, Googling it before there was Google. And there literally no references came up to it, which is a hard thing to do these days. You can Google anything and something's going to come up. And so to me, that showed like, okay, this is this whole kind of hidden lifestyle and history that not only do people not know about, but nobody has written about it.
Right.
And so suddenly, the more I start to find out, I know one, it's a great place to set a story. Two, nobody else has written about it, so it's kind of just waiting to be written. And three, I personally want to see that story, and if nobody else has written it, I guess I have to make it exist. So I love writing about kind of hidden stories, histories, peoples, things that are happening kind of in plain sight that seem to have been, you know, washed from our history or our gaze of this world. And those cowboys were certainly one of those moments. And every single story I've written, in fact, kind of starts with that moment, like coming across something I knew nothing about, had never heard about, never seen, and just have this natural reaction, like, what is going on here? And to me, that's kind of the idea that every single one of my books starts as a surprise and then a kind of journey of discovery. I feel I take the reader on that, starting as a person who knows nothing, instead of being an expert in something and I'm writing, okay, here's how it is. I'm going to tell you what I know because I know everything about this. I write from the point of view, like, I had never heard of this. Like, what's going on? And just like Cole in the book, you know, he's a complete outsider. He's thrown into this world that is completely different than the world he came from. And he has to kind of struggle to figure out, you know, what are the rules of this world? How do I survive there? What do I need to do? And so I kind of incorporate that into the actual storytelling, because that, to me, is the most interesting part of it, is the discovery, the journey of discovery.
Yeah, you really create this beautiful pathway for young readers to understand the hidden history of Black cowboys, because, you know, we've all been socialized into perceiving cowboys as white. And you write about this in Ghetto Cowboys, here when Cole arrives, right, to Philadelphia, and he is talking about cowboys with his father and some of the other guys. And he says, look, you guys might think y'all is cowboys, but all I know is real cowboys is white. The old man shakes his head like I'm a fool. Son, don't you know Black cowboys is a tradition that goes back to before the Civil War? Whatever, I say. He looks disappointed. Not whatever, man. The word cowboy started as a Black word. Wear it proudly. And I think it is so important for educators to learn and teach about Black cowboys, which is hidden and erased in mainstream curriculum in the United States. And when educators teach about westward and Western history, that instruction is incomplete if it does not include the history of Black cowboys. And when it is included in the curriculum, there's a more truthful, clearer understanding of history and a link to the contemporary legacy of Black cowboy.
Yeah, and what I discovered, what I thought was this thing that was only happening in this one neighborhood in Philadelphia, is I started to go around the country with this book. Black cowboys would come out to see me, or, kids would show up to schools with their horses and stuff. And turned out it was happening all over, from New York to LA, Seattle, Chicago, Houston, St. Louis, like everywhere. I find Black cowboys. And so, you hear things now like 1 in 4 cowboys in the Old West were Black cowboys. And I love just kind of how the profile has jumped up lately, so you'll see them in commercials now, you'll see them in other movies. I mean, there's my movie, Concrete Cowboy, but also like Nope, Black cowboys right there.
Little Nas X.
They were, exactly. And they were on the cover of major newspapers during Black Lives Matter, protests and things like that. So that's pretty cool.
Part of the beauty of Ghetto Cowboy is the use of Black language, also referred to as African American vernacular English. For those who are unfamiliar with this, please look into the scholarship of Dr. Valerie Kinlock and Dr. April Baker Bell. And please know that I'm not talking about slang. Black language is a rule-governed based language. I so appreciate how you honor the language that is part of many Black communities like the one you write about. And I wanted to ask, why is the language between the characters and within the community important to capture in this story and in all stories?
Well, how people talk, those dialects really ground the place for me, because, for instance, I went to talk about this book in Russia once, and Russia, huge country, crosses 11 time zones. They didn't understand the concept of dialects, because when the Soviet Union took over, they completely washed all cultural references from the language. So there was one language. And, I was constantly describing how somebody in New York speaks differently than somebody in California, or somebody from Texas, they're from Chicago. And there's like not only different word choices, different accents, but also different attitudes, So to me, it's like everything culturally is kind of grounded through language and how people communicate with each other. And so to me, it immediately puts it in my head, these are these characters. So when I go someplace, I'm very, even though I don't necessarily do it consciously, I'm very aware of how people talk, what kind of words people use, or kind of the rhythms of it, the speed of how they talk and things like that. And to bring that into the writing, because it immediately takes me, it's different if I'm right. I've written about characters in the Bronx, Southside Chicago, deep Alabama, California, like really different places. And it's like a whole different rhythm to it, so it's one of those details. If I like one of the things I'm most proud of, when I go to try to capture a place, a community, of people, if I do my job right and I go back afterwards and I'm talking to those kids, whatever, they want to know what block I live on. Like they think I'm from there.
Yeah.
And I have to tell them, like, oh, I didn't grow up in Philly, I haven't spent time here, but, my job as a writer is to be observant and to kind of honor the place, to notice those tiny details. And that's a key thing when I'm writing about a kid like Cole or like Yummy or some of these other characters that on the surface, it'd be really easy to write them off. Like, oh, I'm not like them. I would never do that thing that they do. But what's more interesting is if you connect with that kid and they do something, and then you may have thought, like, I never would have done that, but now you understand why he did that thing or why he made that choice, and you can accept it and understand it instead of just like, writing it off.
The kind of grace and humanity that you are talking about is rarely extended to Black boys in the United States. And it's critically urgent for Black boys to have access to books like yours with characters like Cole. And I hope that teachers will read aloud part of this book to help them see why this is a good match for them, because many Black boys have been socialized into not reading because they continue to be presented with books that don't engage them, books that do not reflect who they are, and books that do not reflect who they want to be. There are parallels between the stables and horses in Ghetto Cowboy and neighborhood softball teams, travel, baseball, and football teams that exist in so many communities. There's a history of Black men and Black churches literally corralling the youth of neighborhoods into organized sports or clubs, many operating from shoestring budgets. And they do this purely to give Black youth alternatives from the dangerous activities that neighborhoods can sometimes offer. And this is powerfully juxtaposed with the disinvestment in poor Black communities, racial displacement, gentrification, and how the media often portrays disenfranchised communities in the story. How did you navigate the incredible challenge of both affirming Blackness, Black people, Black traditions, the strength and resilience of Black communities, and raising awareness of systemic and structural racism?
Having known and met a lot of people in Philadelphia who might live a mile or two from this neighborhood their whole lives and never having known about it shows kind of how hidden these worlds are. But what amazed me was, the reputation was, you see it in the news, like, this is the neighborhood where all the bad things go down. It's like, you don't want to go to Strawberry Mansion, just stay away. And so they missed this whole other story that's going on. And so one of the things I like to do in my writing is to kind of change the narrative, meaning you can't blame people for thinking what they know if they only know one thing, right? If there's only one story being put out there, this is the most dangerous neighborhood. That's what they know. And so it's kind of up to, creative people from those worlds to use their voice to kind of show it how it really is, And so, one of the attempts first of the book and see the book become a movie, and then to have a sequel come out, from the first book, it's all like narrative changing in the real world, So, even if the city of Philadelphia was trying to destroy this, tradition that had been going on for almost 100 years, instead of celebrating what's an amazing thing, like these guys have been saving animals for decades, devoting their lives to them, and then turning around and giving those animals to young people in those neighborhoods to kind of keep them off the streets and keep them focused, and to teach them how to care for another being, and to teach them, how to be, the cowboy way, and everything that comes with that. And to see kind of the city through the book and the movie and all that kind of change. And suddenly they start showing up in commercials that are celebrating Philadelphia. And not only that, but people know about this story around the world, and you have European documentary filmmakers or photographer or artists coming in. That's pretty big narrative change, but you have to put in the work to do that. You have to be like, there's a conscious effort on that level. But the other level is really kind of just showing people as human beings who are trying to do the right thing, to try to make their world better. And it's not some big grandiose thing like I'm saving, curing cancer or something, or making the world safe, It's just this one thing, it's like, people can't change the world, but you can affect your neighborhood. You can change one life in your neighborhood. None of these people do it for the spotlight or for the glory of it or get credit. They just do it because that's the thing to do, And so those to me are like the real heroes, people who are just doing it because it's the right thing to do. And if nobody ever knew about them, they would still be doing it. So it's kind of one thing I can do is kind of, shine the spotlight on them and the work they're doing and say, hey, this is going on in our world.
And that's really so critically important. I think the story disrupts not necessarily what people know, but what they think they know. And it is important to recognize that these cowboys, as you said, are literally saving young people's lives and the lives of horses. And to consider, why isn't there more funding from animal rights groups and government resources? Why isn't there more of that? And the answers can start to help people see systemic racism at work.
Yeah, and part of it is perception. There's the perception like these guys, they're not some polished organization with, doing bake sales and things like that, but they're just people from the community doing what they can, using their own money, and then other people now join the effort. And then luckily through the movie, the profile has risen a lot. So, for the Urban Riding Club and for this other organization that's raising money to put a permanent stables inside Fairmount Park, almost $500,000 has been raised through, source funding, crowdsourcing. Just like people like, hey, I like to help this stay a reality. That's pretty cool. And that's just like, again, changing the narrative and raising the profile. They're the ones doing the real work.
Ghetto Cowboy is your original work, and Concrete Cowboy is the title of the major motion picture starring Idris Elba and Caleb McLaughlin. For those who have seen the movie but have not yet read the book, there are different plot points. So first, how does it feel to have created the inspiration for the movie? And what are your thoughts about the differences between the two texts, including the title change?
Yeah. Well, having started as a filmmaker, I know the difference between a book and a movie, and they're two different mediums with two different kinds of rules, storytelling rules to them. And that if you literally translated a book to a movie, it would not only be way too long, it doesn't really translate. You have to adapt it. Adapting is the key word. You're taking a work in another medium and translating it into a new medium, and compressing storylines and bringing out other elements. And so, to me, the biggest work is do you approve of the filmmaker, and does the filmmaker have the same kind of goals and point of view that you had in making the book, or do you feel like they're going to honor this community and everything? And with this filmmaker, he had a production company that was less than a couple miles away from the stables. He understood that that community and what they were all about. He spent a lot of time there, so he put in the personal work. He did a couple of short film pieces about them, which were really beautiful and kind of like, oh, that looks like the movie already. And, he was coming at it from an independent filmmaking point of view. And he had a big thrust, on social justice and everything. So everything kind of that I believed in and wanted. And, ultimately, like, this is not our thing. It belongs to the community. So them allowing me to portray that world is really what it's about. And in the beginning, it was kind of let's do a small independent film, use the real people as actors in it, just be like, this is how it is, which he's done in other short films. But then people like Idris became involved, and it became a bigger thing. And a lot of amazing actors came in, and filmmakers like Lee Daniels, things like that. Becomes bigger in profile, but it still is hard, a small independent film. So it's still able to maintain that feel of a small independent film. And there are actual people from those stables in the movie. And so it's this nice blend. And for me, what was really amazing being on set was to see, okay, here was this real place. And I wrote about these locations, inspired the locations in my book. These people inspired these characters. And here we are, we're shooting in the actual locations. Those actual people are there. They're talking directly to the actors, playing characters that I made up that were inspired by them. And the community really turning out and being there. And so it's really felt like a family thing. And, and filming on streets that had never been filmed on before, felt pretty amazing. So, to me, it's like, yeah, there are some differences, but I understood every single reason why there were different choices on things. But to me, when the end credits rolled, it had the same exact feeling that I got from the book, right? And to me, that's the most important thing. Like, how does it resonate for you in the end? And to me, it resonated the same way.
And I think it can be challenging to visualize an urban community that includes stables. So the movie, of course, makes this possible. But we also have to shout out Jesse Joshua Watson, who has created these incredible illustrations throughout the book that really, really help readers to visualize the setting, the neighborhood, and the idea of houses. The idea of horses, in the streets of Philadelphia. So I would be remiss to not shout out these beautiful, stunning illustrations. So let's talk a little bit about Polo Cowboy. What can readers expect in Polo Cowboys, which you wrote prior to the movie? Concrete Cowboys. So, in what way will we continue to see Cole develop and navigate the world around him?
Polo Cowboy picks up literally, seconds after the first book ends, which ended with this race between Cole and his dad Harper, which we don't see the end of. And, the first thing I noticed when I started going out with Ghetto Cowboy, kids always want to know who won the race, but I was always wanted to leave it open. Well, what do you think?
Yeah.
But then of course, a lot of people loved it and wanted to know when I was going to do another book about them. And I was always felt, I didn't know what else I was going to write about. I kind of put everything in that book. But then I met this other kid who's from that neighborhood, and he was like, I know what you should write about. And he started telling me about this other stable in Fairmount Park that had the first African-American polo team, which I had heard about before and kind of, couldn't really fit into the first book. And he kind of straddled both those worlds. The polo world and the cowboy world are completely separate, as different as, hockey and speed skating or something. And then two never crossed. And so I was kind of intrigued that this cowboy had taken up polo, and what was that about? And as I got to know that world a bit more, I realized there's this perception about polo. It's kind of an elite, the king of sports, they call it. We think of it as this white sport where people, drink champagne out in the lawn, and, it's this very elegant thing. But it's pretty gutsy and dangerous sport, where you have 6 to 8 players, each on animals that weigh 1,100 pounds, charging against each other 30 miles an hour, whacking this ball with this wood hammer that's shooting through the air. You could get tossed into the herd, and and they're bumping and grinding, and they wear armor, and it's just like this thing. And what really kind of attracted me was, seeing mixed gender teams, so or girl teams, boy teams, and seeing some girl polo players pretty tough. And so I started thinking about kind of the West Side Story with horses, these two different worlds and two kind of star-crossed, kids meet. And even though, the two worlds don't want anything to do with each other, they find a way to come together. And as a way to talk about these two different things. And it was the same kind of reaction, what, black polo teams, what are you talking about? And just to see everything that stable has been able to do is pretty amazing. They went literally from being kind of the bad news bears of polo, the worst team you could possibly imagine, with kind of made up equipment and horses that weren't really trained for polo, and to becoming national champions. And then kids who had literally never left their neighborhood, not only traveling to other states and playing university teams like Harvard and Yale and beating them, but, getting college, polo scholarships for college, traveling to Europe and Africa for tournaments, things like that. That sport really opened up their world. And even to the point where they became fashion models for Ralph Lauren Polo, and they were part of the big media campaign, like all these black polo players a couple years ago. It was pretty cool, just as a starting point, right? Then, and two, it's the idea of a sequel in general is you do the same story, but just kind of do bigger and more, whatever, which I didn't want to do. And this was such kind of a left field, unexpected turn. It got me excited to write about these characters again. And it was also really nice to pick up with these characters, because you kind of miss them. And then as soon as you start writing, they're kind of instantly there, fully formed. And it's okay, I'm going to take you and now drop you in this other world and see what happens,
What can young readers look forward from you next?
Well, I like to mix it up. I do novels, graphic novels, picture books. And so and try to always do something unexpected. So next spring, I have a book. It's called Christo and Jean-Claude Wrap the World,
Yeah.
which is about these two amazing environmental artists who kind of took art out of the museums and put it into public spaces and changed the art world. And it's really about this idea, what is art and who gets to make it? And it kind of takes it out of these elite forms and makes it a thing for the people. And they had such a tremendous output and an incredible attitude, and they were really rebels. But their whole journey really gets into that question of what is art. And that's what really attracted me to that story. Is somebody who grew up, as an artist and painted and did all these, visual art forms. I love the idea. And even, I was in Austria last year, and me and my daughter started doing public art murals and graffiti, things like that. And it's the idea of taking art and putting it into public spaces and getting reactions from people who are, see it unexpectedly. It's a pretty interesting thing. And then I have a graphic novel kind of follow up to my book Yummy, which took place 20 years ago in Chicago, and it's kind of in the same neighborhood today and things that are going on the South Side in Chicago. I have a book about my adventures in Antarctica, which we're just kind of getting close to the end of, which is the first book I've written that I'm actually in. And I'm kind of the main character, although I did it from the point of view, because I was able to go to Antarctica for 2 months a few years ago and had this incredible experience. But I always like to say Antarctica made me feel like that kid I grew up who was really interested in explorers. And so I make it about my 10-year-old self going to Antarctica, which is kind of that allowed me to kind of write about me in a book as opposed to me now. And then I'm doing a big epic nonfiction book that's about the history of this space program from the Black perspective and kind of how it changed civil rights movement. And it's filled with all kinds of stories you've never heard.
In the video you made on the day that Concrete Cowboy premiered on YouTube, you spoke about the way the world can open up to Black youth when they ride a horse. The elevation in height, you said, can result in a change in attitudes for both the riders and those who have to look up to them. Your work lifts up young readers, changes perspectives, and opens up the world to them. What does it mean to you to be a Black creator?
Well, I always talk about race. I like to say I write about race in all my books, but I prefer to write about the human race, And in this book about Christo, they say, because people are always trying to define them. Well, what are you? And they say, well, labels are very important, but mostly for bottles of wine. And so to me, it's both a way that's opened up my career as a writer, but it's also like a double-edged sword. I like to push against it, So I have, one of the great things I love is I did this book about Johnny Cash with A.G. Ford, and the idea that these two men of color writing about this country, star was a pretty cool kind of radical thing to do, I thought. And so I love kind of turning the tables. And another picture book I wrote about, Simon and Garfunkel and their childhood friendship. And, I just got an email from somebody last week it was from this community of Jewish women in Queens, which is where that story comes from. And they wanted to know, like, they were so impressed, like, how I portrayed that world. They basically wanted to know, where in Queens did I live and what tribe did I belong to? And it was like, I'm not Jewish, I'm not from there, but, I'm a writer, and my job is to honor people, a neighborhood, a way of life, and to do it right. And if I do it right, I get, words like that coming back at me. So it's both like an honor to tell stories that aren't being told about kids of color, but also to be a little subversive and do things that I'm not supposed to do. Like, I really believe, we as humans, we're writing about the human condition. And that to me is the number one way to approach a story, regardless of the color of the characters. But if you tell a human story, it doesn't matter what color you are. As a reader, you'll be able to walk in those characters' footsteps and relate to them in a way you might not have thought when you picked it up.
Thank you so much, Greg. So appreciate you.
Hey, my pleasure.
Thanks for checking out this episode of the Black Creators Series, a Candlewick Press and Red Clay Educators collaboration. Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notifications button so you won't miss an episode. For more information about the Black Creators Series, go to blackcreatorseries.candlewick.com or sonjacherrypaul.com, or go to Red Clay Ed on Twitter and Instagram.